So let me introduce the first speaker, Professor Mauro Schechter. He will be presenting how stigma is impacting the 1990 goals. Mauro Schechter is currently a professor on infectious diseases at the Department of Preventive Medicine of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He's also adjunct professor of epidemiology at the Graduate School of Public Health in the University of Pittsburgh, and an associate in the Department of International Health in the Bloomberg School of Hygiene and Public Health in the Johns Hopkins University.
Good afternoon, everyone. Initially, I'd like to thank the organizers, particularly Mark, for inviting me, and Javier, of course, inviting me to give this presentation on how will stigma impact the 1990 goals. As I believe most of you know, in 2014, the UNAIDS, the Joint Program on the United Nations on HIV/AIDS, they launched this initiative called 1990, which according to them would be a new HIV treatment narrative that will lay the groundwork to end the AIDS epidemic. If we look more carefully, they said that would be the final chapter of the AIDS epidemic. But what is 1990? It is that 90% of the persons living with HIV/AIDS are diagnosed. 90% of the diagnosed ones are linked to care and started on ART, and 90% of persons on ART would have an undetectable viral load. But the question is could it be the final chapter of the AIDS epidemic? What does it really mean? A strategy to end the epidemic, or a metric to evaluate and compare HIV/AIDS programs, see how they're doing? And when it was launched in 2014, and I've said that many times for people who know me, it already did not make sense to my mind, because we knew at that time, if 1990 was reached, the epidemic would not end. These are data from the UK showing in 2013 that 1990 had been reached a long time before among MSM in the UK. And as you can see in the top line, the top blue line, 1990 had been reached many years ago, and the number of cases kept going up and up and up. It had gone up 25% in the previous decade, in spite of 1990 hadn't been reached. So why could it not be the final chapter? First, because a fourth 90 is missing. It's not only getting to be undetectable, you have to remain undetectable for 90 years, for the whole life. And more important to me, it medicalizes the response, leaving the responsibility entirely on the hands of the governments, physicians, pharmaceutical industries. It did not include societal involvement. And I think a gross mistake, knowing what we know, that it presupposed that we can treat ourselves of the epidemic. And they have the example of syphilis. Syphilis has a very short transmission period as opposed to HIV. It's 100% curable as opposed to HIV with 1 to 3 shots. Under DOT, directly observed therapy, is extremely cheap treatment, everything the opposite of HIV. And we have not eliminated syphilis, have not reached the final chapter of syphilis, exactly the opposite. So to our theme, the first 90 is diagnosis. And data from Argentina, if you look at one of the populations that most affected by stigma, transgender women, for you to be diagnosed, you have to come into contact the health system. And 41% of women, trans women, they say they avoid contact with health services. Why? Because of discrimination by healthcare workers and by other patients. So there you are, you cannot even get diagnosed if you don't have contact with the health system. And the other 3/4 to my mind, they're all the same things: treatment, adherence, persistence, starting treatment, stay on treatment, adhering to treatment, persisting on treatment. They are more or less the same. And if we look at data from all over the world, these are aggregate data from 41 countries in all the continents. It's known that by the 3rd year after starting treatment, at least around 50% of patients are not more in care, are not retained in care. It's not that they are not undetectable, they're no longer in care around the world. Doesn't really matter how you slice the pie, if by gender, by clinical stage, by the age they started art, or their CD4 count. And even if you look at countries, people who stay in care, like the UK, we don't have a shortage of drugs. The drugs are there, and we hear people stay in care. And this here, it shows people who are in care and how many experience virologic failures after being in care for many years. And if you look on the left, bottom line is the time on art. And if you look on the bottom left, of people who have been in care 6 to 8, 8 to 10, or 10 to 13 years, still being in care and undetectable, say after 6 years, undetectable, 6% fail. And we're talking being in care and persisting undetectable for life. And what are the predictors of all these things, of non-adherence, non-staying treatment, non-persisting on treatment? They're consistent in all of them. All studies we do, they all, in a way, or most of them, related to stigma. Lack of social or family support, or perception of insufficient support by society or family. Lack of acceptance of HIV infection. Lack of place where to keep medicines, which is an indirect measure or a demonstration of stigma. Depression and suicidal ideation. In a way, low level of schooling at a younger age, which make you a person more vulnerable to schooling, to stigma and discrimination, give the person fewer tools to combat stigma and discrimination. But when you talk about stigma and discrimination, most people, including myself, we tend to think of the so-called key populations. But here are data from the Netherlands looking at HIV-infected young adults on art, on treatment, who fail therapy. And if you look at them, one of the biggest, largest predictors of failure is acquiring HIV, but the heterosexual route. So there's something there that in another group, whom is not considered a key population general, who in general is not seen as suffering stigma and discrimination, because we, including myself, tend to think of stigma and discrimination affecting other populations, might be also the victim of that for other reasons that we normally don't consider. And if you think of the whole of Europe, and here are data, recent data from Europe, from the European CDC. And if we look, 2 countries, Belgium and Luxembourg, which I marked with these red arrows, in these 2 countries, over 50% of new cases are due to heterosexual transmission, both among males and females. So heterosexual transmission is playing a large role in these countries. And young people, like you saw in Holland, are failing therapy. So for them, we have to also look what's happening to them and what role discrimination and stigma might be playing for them as well, not only for the so-called key populations. As I said, I think one of the most big problems is that it does not include societal involvement. Because stigma is not an individual attitude. Stigma is a societal attitude. It is a discrimination against a group, people, disease, a place, a nation. It is associated with lack of knowledge about how an infection spreads, a need to blame someone, fears about a disease and death, and gossip that spreads rumors and myths. And for those of us who live in Latin America, We know the power of gossips, rumors, and myths, particularly now in my country, when these come from government or people closely associated to government. So coming back to my question, do I think that 1990 is the final chapter of the epidemic? Is it a strategy to end the epidemic? No. A resounding no. I don't think we can end the epidemic by treatment. But I think that is an extremely useful metric to evaluate and compare HIV/AIDS program. We need metrics to know how we're doing and how to do better. I think this is extremely important. And I conclude by saying that stigma and discrimination are the main impediments for achieving each of the 90, or the four, I repeat four, because you need to be undetectable for 90 years, or I'm joking, but for very long, goals. The 1990 goals can only be achieved through societal engagement. Societal engagement, in turn, is the only possible way to combat stigma and discrimination. And if stigma and discrimination are not actively combated, 1990 goals cannot be achieved. And I think it's also important to say that the message, to my mind, the message of the 1990 being the final chapter epidemic is the wrong message. It's the wrong message to donors, because it conveys the idea that no more funds are necessary because the epidemic is ending anyway. It conveys the wrong message to attract young investigators because, oh, well, all scientific problems have been solved. Let's investigate something else. It also the wrong message to promote behavioral changes. Because it says, well, the epidemic is ending anyway. Why should I change my behavior? But I don't want to end on a pessimistic note. On the contrary, on a very optimistic note. If you remember, right at the beginning, I showed data from the UK showing that in spite of reaching in 1990, the number of new cases in MSM kept going up in the UK till 2014. But then came PrEP. And when PrEP arrived, look what happened. The number of new cases dropped precipitously. It never had dropped before. The mere arrival of PrEP led to a decline in 4 years of 35% of new cases, even before PrEP is really, really widespread used. And that's been seen, for instance, in New South Wales, in Australia, and other places. For instance, in São Paulo, Brazil, although there's no real large-scale distribution among white MSM in São Paulo who have money to buy it, the number of new cases for the first time went down. It didn't go down amongst mixed race and black MSM because they're poorer and they cannot afford to buy it. And there's very little, or there's not enough in the public sector. So with them, the number of new cases kept going up. But amongst white MSM, it went down, showing that PrEP can really impact the epidemic. Finally, I'd like to thank Lucy Vasconcelos and Marcia Rashid, who helped me with the slides, providing slides and helpful discussions. And again, thank the organizers and Mark and Javier for inviting me.